Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mindshifting Moments. I'm your host, Margaret WIlliamson, and we started the show because I believe that the best way to gain confidence in alternative medicines is by asking questions and getting answers from those people who are actually living that subject matter on a daily basis. This show is brought to you by Nucleus Holdings, an organization working to destigmatize the psychedelic industry through data, tools, and conversation. And today's big question is, are magic mushrooms or psilocybin the gateway psychedelic? And to help me answer that question, I have the Chief Psychedelic Officer and founder of HAVN Life, Dr. Ivan Casselman. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited because you really are sort of like the triple crown when it comes to kind of a triple crown winner when it comes to psychedelics. You've got the personal background, the educational background, and most definitely the professional experience to really sit at the forefront of this industry. And I know that coupled with your just true passion for fungi, right, in general, really brought me to, when I saw the title of today's show, I knew that you would be the perfect guest to help us kind of unpack that question and get to the heart of maybe some of the definitions of that word.
Yeah, no, 100%. And up to this point, the term gateway, especially when we're talking about psychedelic compounds, has not had a positive connotation. It's a case of you take one compound, and all of a sudden you're taking more compounds and you're addicted to this, and it's a whole sort of spiral, down this deep dark hole. Whereas gateway, a gateway could be a very positive term. We can take mushroom. I mean, typically mushrooms are one of the first psychedelic compounds that people experiment with. So, your mind gets open to the possibilities of what is possible with mushrooms. I know for my, in my own personal journey, that opened the door to and a desire to try other compounds and to see where those things took you as well. So, yeah.
Isn't that what people are afraid of a little bit? You hear gateway when it's like, okay, you start with sneaking a beer, from your dad's fridge, or maybe, you start with a little homemade apple bong, and now, people imagine that 2 steps later, I'm doing heroin, or, now I'm hooked on cocaine or some of these other, deep opioids. And you sort of said the same thing, that, you try psilocybin first, and it sort of will open you up to wanting to experiment in some of these other ways. But is that something that people should be worried about?
No. So the beautiful thing about psychedelics is that they actually have a harm reduction strategy built right into the chemistry and the physiology and how it interacts with our body. So, for example, you take mushrooms, you take a 3.5 gram dose of mushrooms. You try to take that same dose again the next day, you'll get diminishing returns, as in you won't get as as high, or you won't have the same sort of level of psychedelic experience. And you take it again the next day, that'll happen again. It'll happen again because your neurotransmitters, they get a workout, right? And your body needs time to replenish those neurotransmitters. So unlike something like heroin or cocaine, where you take it every day and you can take more and more and more, and you still get that effect. With most psychedelics, you wouldn't get that effect. So the gateway idea or concept doesn't make as much sense.
I love that. Okay, so explain that. Is there another compound that has that similar type of effect of diminishing returns, where your body sort of limits and self-regulates that?
Yeah. Basically, all of your classic alkaloid-based hallucinogens are that, like, that's the way they work. So LSD, mescaline, all of those ones. They I'm not sure as much about DMT. It's because it's very short acting, but all the classic hallucinogens that last for a long time. The harm reduction strategy built into the chemistry of the plant.
So interesting. And so then let's switch to the other side. So if we say, most people, their first experience with psychedelics is with psilocybin. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, yes, mushrooms are easy to grow. It's like it's a very plentiful product. I mean, at least like in Vancouver, you can actually just walk into stores and buy psilocybin containing mushrooms. We'll talk about the future of psychedelics later on, but yeah, it's a very ubiquitous psychedelic. In most regions in the world, in most temperate regions in the world anyways, they grow in the wild. I can walk into the bush here in BC and pick psilocybin containing mushrooms in Australia, in the UK, in the US. So I think that's sort of why people initially start with mushrooms, is just because of the access.
Easy access. Okay, so now that it's getting me a picture, in my mind, and I'm very novice here, but okay, I'm picturing through. I'm walking through the forest, and I see mushrooms. What makes one mushroom psychedelic and others not, or are all mushrooms sort of psychedelic?
So no, not all mushrooms are psychedelic. Only a very certain type are, and they typically fall into the genus psilocybe. So your most common, like the magic mushroom, it's called Psilocybe cubensis. It's more of a tropical strain, but there are several psilocybe species that contain psilocybin, which converts into psilocybin in your body, and that's the compound that makes you hallucinate or gives you the psychedelic experience.
How do you tell one from another?
The most definitive way to identify mushrooms is with a spore print. You put it under a microscope, and each mushroom has a very distinct spore. With psilocybe mushrooms, another really interesting trick is that if you kind of bruise the skin, they'll actually turn blue, because compounds will create a blue color. But that's not a definitive way of identifying it. So please don't go through the bush and eat anything that scores blue. There are a few other factors. Typically, when people are looking at doing mushrooms for the very first time, they're either obtaining them from an expert who's picked them in the wild, but more often they've been cultivated, and that's what my company HAVN does. We cultivate in a GACP regulated laboratory. Everything's under sterile conditions, because mushrooms, just like a lot of other fungus, also they can be contaminated and all this kind of stuff. So you want a good product. Quality psychedelics equal quality experience.
I'm glad that you took us there, because I think part of this stigma that we have and this fear is through not really understanding it, right? So this conception that, well, psychedelic mushrooms, grow through feces and grow on poop. It's actually the most popular article on our platform asked that question. And you talked about it, right then, that, hey, there's a part where, you can find this in the wild. But when we talk about being ready for consumption and for mass adoption and to use it in a medicinal way, you really have to pay attention to how it's cultivated and making sure that you get even dosage. Talk to me about that process and what you guys are doing to ensure some of that standardized component to the medicine.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the mythology that mushrooms grow very, very well on feces. And actually one of the ways that psilocybe has, now has a global reach is because of the transportation of animals, mainly things like cows and stuff like that, to other continents. And that's how they spread. But you don't have to grow them on manure. The mushrooms that we grow in the lab, we have a proprietary matrix that we grow it on. We use a little bit of agricultural waste, but we don't use any animal waste. It's all plant matter. So yeah, you don't, the whole mushrooms grow on poop thing, I don't know, it's not super patable. But honestly, if you had a mushroom that was grown on poop versus the way that we grow them in the lab, and once they're dried and ready for consumption, probably not going to be able to tell the difference. The big thing, and what we're really driving at with HAVN, is to ensure that this medicine is quality controlled and it's standardized. So just very similar to any other herbal or fungal products that you would get on the shelf in a drugstore or whatever, we want to make sure that these products are safe for consumption, and the effects that you're getting from them are derived from the psychedelic compounds and not because they've got some strange bacteria or something like that in them.
Right, exactly. Now, when we talk about psilocybin, and we know now that it's a certain strain of mushrooms, but there's a lot of healing properties from mushrooms in general. And your company is actually working on some products that are non-psychedelic, but still fungi based. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. I mean, mushrooms as like a category of food slash medicine is an extraordinary category of study and research. And North Americans in particular are a little bit hesitant when it comes to mushrooms. We have a little bit of mycophobia. I know growing up, in school and stuff like that, everyone's like, don't eat the mushrooms, don't touch the mushrooms, they're dangerous, they're poisonous. When in fact, a very small percentage of mushrooms are in fact poisonous and dangerous. The majority of them are not going to really cause much effect. And there's a small percentage of them that have a high medicinal value, whether it be a psychedelic mushroom or a medicinal mushroom. I know in Chinese traditional medicine, they've got a vast array of different mushrooms and treatments that they use those mushrooms for, and they're far more advanced in that their medical structure than we are in North America. But the wonderful news is that everyone's really sort of switching on to mushrooms and really starting to understand all of the benefits, whether it be psychedelic or medicinal or just the food benefits of those mushrooms.
And I agree with you, that it feels like the tides are turning, that a new wave is kind of coming through. Uh, but it begs that question, like, man, why were we gone from that thinking so long? Or why was that kept from us? And you talked about it for a minute, that there's just a lot of like fear-based culture around not only just mushrooms, but a lot of preventative healing medicines. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, there was a trend after World War II, at the whole better living through chemistry trend, where the driver was, we don't need plants and nature. What we need to do is we need to get into the lab and we need to structure these compounds or whatever, and we'll create things ourselves. Humans will create these medicines or foods or whatever. As it turns out, we still have like over 70% of our medicines are derived in some way from a natural product, whether it be plants or fungus or animals. So, I mean, our better living through chemistry, it was a great idea, but we still go back to nature over and over and over again. And I think now we've seen a generation kind of pass, and we're starting to understand that disease is not a war, right? We don't have to fight against these diseases. Really, actually, the better strategy is to start to prevent disease far before it happens. Healthy lifestyle, healthy eating, herbal medicines, and again, that's the major difference between Asian-based medical traditions like Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine and European-based medical systems, is that in Asia they prevent, whereas in North America and Europe we're looking at curing things. So yeah, but there's a shift. The NHP market, natural healthcare product market, has been like year over year building and building. It does something ridiculous like 15 or 20% growth per year, and it just does. There's no sign of stopping. So the consumers want it. So give them what they want, right?
Exactly. And when you talk about that, and you're saying that even pressing through, getting past some of that fear-based culture, looking at and starting to ask those questions, like, well, why are we more concerned with treatment instead of prevention? And understanding that if we can back up our point of view a little bit more and kind of get this wider view, then it becomes much easier to take action on those things. And in my opinion, that's sort of what psychedelics can do for you. It allows people to sort of back up and have more of a world view. Would you find that to be true in your experience?
Yeah, it's a typical progression of people that start to experiment with psychedelic compounds, in that they definitely start to build a more expansive view of society and a more inclusive view. And I mean, for me personally, and I know having talked to other people with the same experience, it really starts to let you see your place in the world and in society, and it really makes you want to kind of collaborate and cooperate to make society a better place and the world a better place. And I mean, it starts with making yourself a better person. And I mean, yeah, it's hard to list off all the benefits of psychedelics, but it certainly gives you a very expansive view of the world, and your place in it.
So maybe we'll indulge it and say that, okay, maybe psilocybin is the gateway into psychedelics in a very positive interpretation of the terms, and it would lead you in. Where would you see people going after they've had an experience with psilocybin? What pathway do you typically see people take?
Yeah, well, for me anyways, once I had that initial psychedelic experience, I was really sort of captivated by what those compounds do to your mind, because again, we're trained to think that, you know, our everyday waking state is normal, you know, and everything else outside of that is abnormal, and we don't want to push ourselves into that abnormal condition, right? We want to stay normal. But when in fact what psychedelics do is it actually strips away our survival mechanisms, and it allows us to see more of the world. So once you've experienced, say, mushrooms, I think the desire to try other compounds that are similar is very high. So typically mushrooms and LSD are typically the sort of the most I guess the most used as far as initial psychedelics go. Yeah. And then you have some of the shorter acting compounds like Salvia divinorum. Salvia divinorum doesn't really factor in as much anymore because there's a lot of regulation around it. 10 years ago, there wasn't any regulation, so you could just buy it at a head shop or whatever. So that gave people more access to it. And then DMT as well. DMT is the most plentiful psychedelic in the plant kingdom. Like, you find it in dozens and dozens of plants. And it's relatively easy to extract as well. So, you know, it's also something on the market, but you can't eat it. You have to smoke it. So, you know, there's some things that you got to know about the compounds.
Now, it seems like, okay, if this is something that's readily found in nature, you know, it's not something, like you're saying, is definitely difficult to extract if you know what you're doing, right? There's not huge barriers, but yet in our minds, there's a part of us that think, you know, hey, if it was illegal, then that had to have been for our best interest. And there's got to be something that they're not telling me. Otherwise, the government would have allowed us to maintain access.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the government doesn't really have the best interest of its citizens. What it does is it creates mechanisms to make governance as easy as possible for them. And in this case, you know, allowing a population access to a mind expanding substances that make them, you know, think differently and act differently and change themselves. It's not something that the government's really keen on having, you know. Whereas alcohol, you know, that does not inspire anyone to change themselves. You know, you in the evening you're drunk, by the morning you're sober, and you get back to work. And I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of the war on drugs propaganda really came out of the sort of the last wave of psychedelic use in our society, which was, you know, in the 60s. And there was a lot of, what really got the government sort of nervous was the whole dropout scenario, because, you know, they want people, you know, at their desks and doing the work and keeping society ticking along, right? So yeah, I mean, they regulated it because they were afraid, and it was the easiest path for them to do, which is unfortunate because it totally knocked out any potential of developing, you know, starting to develop the medicinal protocols that you can use with psychedelics. You know, that was, you know, back in the 60s, and now we're, you know, 2022, and we're now just starting to get it back around to, you know, really getting to the research and really finding a path to get that medicine to the people. But it's a different conversation now, because we're not just talking about, you know, a bunch of hippies, you know, going and doing LSD in the field and dancing around, right? We're now talking about, you know, companies like yours and mine focused on the problem. We're talking about, you know, people like very at-risk groups like veterans and first responders and all these people with PTSD and all this kind of stuff. And psychedelics work, and it's been shown to work again and again and again. We just need to get that government, pushed forward a little bit. Just get them to start regulating this stuff.
And it feels like we can be hopeful because we did see what happened over the last decade or so, couple decades with cannabis. And so would you draw like some pretty clear parallels between those two industries in the way that we could probably see some progression happening?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I mean, the future is bright as far as psychedelics go. I mean, we had a few blips kind of in the 90s where the psychedelic research kind of got up and going, but no momentum. But now, I mean, it's got momentum. I mean, once things get onto the public markets, onto the stock exchange, that momentum is going to be driven forward. So as far as the parallels between cannabis and psychedelics, like here in Canada, I mean, Canada was the first country in the world to have federal medical access to cannabis. And we basically have all the mechanisms in place that allow that access. And now we can recreate those mechanisms and use them for psychedelics. So I think that the cannabis was definitely the tip of the spear. It helped people understand that just because the government has said for 50 years that this is bad, actually no. The fabric of Canadian society has certainly not disintegrated into chaos, right? We've got a new industry. We're creating new jobs, and I can walk into a store. I can buy a beer with my credit card. I can go to the next store and I can buy a joint with my credit card. I have the choice to, it's like cognitive freedom, right? I have the choice what I want to do with my body, what I want to do with my mind, and the compounds that I want to ingest. And really, at the end of the day, the government really shouldn't have a say in what I put into my body. All I want them to do is just kind of regulate and quality control them.
And I see that perspective, and wonder that as minds change and we do feel like, okay, we want to utilize some of these medicines. You're kind of saying, yeah, we should be able to go in the store the same way we can buy a beer and a joint these days, that we should be able to go and buy these psychedelic compounds. Yet I do hear some caution about the container in which you take some of these medicines, and making that distinction between them being recreational drugs and healing medicines. How would you make?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting conversation, and my observation from the current conversation is that people are kind of weighting the correctness of use towards a therapeutic or traditional way. But basically, when it comes to use patterns, there's three general use patterns for psychedelics. There's a traditional use, something like ayahuasca. There's a therapeutic use, so using LSD or mushrooms in a therapeutic context. But there's also free-form use, typically called recreational use. But again, we go back to the war on drugs propaganda and the type of language that they use. For some reason, like recreational use is kind of looked down on a little bit, or shoved to the side, when in fact, all of those use patterns can create valid psychedelic experiences. And I can say from experience that I've experienced extraordinary, healing experiences in all three of those contexts, right? So I think the conversation right now, like society's not quite ready to say, oh, let's go to our psychedelic dispensary and buy a tab of LSD and hang out with our friends for the weekend. They're not ready for that. But they are ready to say, hey, this first responder has PTSD, and we're going to give them a psychedelic within a very defined container, and we're going to help them heal. Society is ready for that. So society we've got to ease them into this, right? Because we have two generations of society that have been programmed by the war on drugs propaganda, and not programmed with truth and fact, but it's basically a fear campaign, and it's propaganda. So we have to take this one step at a time.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, the similar path. Again, like another parallel to that cannabis industry where we saw kind of that first public adoption being used for medicinal purposes and treatment of, ailments and diseases that were not, being helped with traditional therapies. And
yeah, one of the big examples for the cannabis industry was, children with epilepsy. You see a child with epilepsy having a seizure, and and you see them with cannabis and how well it works. Like you can't argue with that, right? You have a soldier that comes home from a theater of war and has PTSD. You use psychedelics on them, and they start to feel better. They start to become more productive members of society. You can't argue with that. So there's some fundamentals that from a medical treatment perspective that we can't argue with, and I think that's really we need to lean on those as the foundation of our conversation going forward. We'll get to the conversation about psychedelic dispensaries and all that kind of stuff, but it's going to take some time.
But I mean, I think I agree with you. The future is bright, and I would say, to any of our listeners that are, wondering if psychedelics is right for them, where would you recommend that they start?
So that's a very good question. My favorite sort of information source for psychedelics is Erowid. It's EROWID.org, Erowid, and it's a long time website. It's got tons and tons of information on it. Now, as far as stepping into actually using these compounds, the first caveat is that in the majority of the world, it's not legal to use. If you're on a trip in Portugal or Jamaica or a few other jurisdictions, by all means, it might be a thing. So that's the first thing that we have to determine whether we're willing to take that risk. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it's all about making sure that the supply or where you get your compounds from is a trusted source. And there's a lot of really good material out there, but it's not all created equal. The wonderful thing now is that we have more and more access to things like testing kits and all that kind of stuff. I buy testing kits from dancesafe.org. I'm not repping them or anything like that. I think they have some really great testing kits and all that kind of stuff. So there are some things that you can do to ensure the quality of your compounds. Now that's just sourcing. You also have to make sure that you're in a good place with good people in a good mindset. So you really have to, just because it's Saturday night and all your friends are doing psychedelics, you do have to take some time to make sure that it's set and setting, right? So your mental state is good and your surroundings are good. Make sure that. And then for me anyways, I was very lucky to have somebody that was very knowledgeable about psychedelics that guided me through my first couple of experiences and made sure I was safe and made sure I had the knowledge necessary. Not necessarily another person in your life, but there's a lot of good information out there on the internet as well. So definitely. It's a hard question to answer because you should definitely try it, but you should be really, really careful.
Yeah, I agree. And, that's what we're trying to do at Nucleus is really be that hub to destigmatize the industry through data, through research, through information and conversations like this, because, we believe that path of well-being has to start with knowledge and opening your mind, understanding, and then you can take action. And we're excited to bring partners that allow our readers and our viewers and our subscribers to actually take action when the time is ready for them. And I love especially that you're here from HAVN Life because you guys are really bridging that gap. You're taking people into this sort of natural healthcare, plant-based medicine mindset. And you have products that are on the market in some places, ready to be on the market in others.
Yep.
And as they sort of join this HAVN Life family, right, the view is that eventually, probably pretty soon, they will be able to also purchase psychedelic medicines.
Correct. Yeah. So we have a line of medicinal mushrooms that are available on Amazon, and we're slowly starting to roll out distribution in Canada, and we'll start to do that in the US shortly as well. And yeah, we're working with a number of organizations in Canada and Health Canada to start making our mushrooms available, our psychedelic mushrooms available to certain types of patients. It's slow going. I think in Canada we have less than 40 patients that are sort of allowed to use psychedelic mushrooms via paperwork with the Canadian government. Yeah, so it's coming along, but 40 people is not a market. But like we understood that it was going to take 3 to 5 years to kind of get to where we needed to be to be a profitable company, and we're willing to put in the work, not just to build our own company, but to build the entire industry, right? So we've got lots of industry partners, and we really try to build up our partners so they can do what they do well, which eventually hopefully will trickle down to allow us to start selling our mushrooms.
Exactly. I agree, right? We don't make smaller pieces of the pie, just make a bigger pie, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, fill up the pie shell.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for, participating in this conversation, helping us to unpack this question, are magic mushrooms or psilocybin the gateway psychedelic? And I think that the answers that we came up to are, as long as you have the right framing of the word gateway, then yes, they can be this gateway into the psychedelic industry and into this journey of mind expansion, healing, and optimization.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's all about how we frame that term. And yeah, like I said before, the future is bright. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of great people, a lot of great companies out there that are doing amazing things. And yeah, I'm really excited to see what the future holds.
Me too. Me too. And if you guys want to hear more about what Dr. Casselman thinks for the future and what psychedelics will play in our future of humanity, then we stay tuned, because we'll be releasing a special event over the next coming weeks where we dive into a conversation about the future of psychedelics. But today, thank you so much for listening in on this mind shifting moment. I would love to hear if your mind was shifted during the show. Please drop us a comment, send me an email, leave me a post on Instagram, whatever your preferred platform is. And if you want to reach out to Dr. Casselman or myself, you can find both of the companies through our database, through Nucleus and through Newly, which is a database that's connecting organizations, entrepreneurs, patients, therapists, and researchers like Dr. Casselman in one hub to destigmatize the psychedelic industry. Once again, I'm Margaret WIlliamson. Thank you guys so much and have a great week.
Thanks so much.